Hello and welcome back, this is ProTailDev, back with another remaster video, back to Corrupting Spring, and we're going to be working on the lighting this time. Let's get straight into it. Okay, so let's start off with looking at mist. So I know this isn't lighting, but this video isn't strictly going to be lighting, it's going to be all different things. Lighting just happens to be one of the focuses. But what I wanted was a mist effect for the water, because the water is a little bit bland and boring, and so I wanted to add a bit of effect. However, I eventually deleted it because it just doesn't look great and it would actually be too intense having mist everywhere. Because there's so much space and flat area, mist would have to be pretty vast. It's different in other games when it's enclosed spaces because you can have mist in smaller areas, just have them larger, the particles. But because it's such a big area and it's so open, you can just see from quite far, it would just be too much particles. So I do a little bit of a test here. But already it's quite a lot of particles that would be needed. I would need to resize the particles, but I just put them there as just a nice little thing. I don't actually have the texture for it, but I'll delete that later. Now moving on to the settings, so I make sure that the settings are right for quality and for the lighting settings. This is so that I can kind of play around with it and make sure it's okay. I changed the intensity of the lighting for the specific scene to make it a little bit brighter, because one of the feedbacks I got for Corrupting Spring during the game jam was that it was a little bit too dark and hard to see things. I wanted that as an effect to make the fireflies better and more stand out, but unfortunately it just makes the scene a little bit too dark. So a lot of different changes here, a lot of different changes to the shadows as well, strength of the shadows and playing around with that. And I also changed the colour of the directional light. So I made a bunch of changes, different lighting changes, to make the scene a little bit nicer and better. Then I move on to the claim. So what I wanted the claim to be is that I wanted it to glow, just to make it more obvious that the player has to go to it. So I wanted to add, so I added a mission. I created a new material, added a mission, and made it yellow. And then what I did is on the main camera I made sure that bloom was enabled, which it wasn't previously. In order for the emission to work you need bloom enabled. There you go, you can see it's a bit brighter, and it just kind of stands out a little bit more to the player. What I also did was add a point light to it to make, because emission doesn't really emit light, it just makes it glow. But what you need to do is add a point light to it and basically give these, make it look like it's actually glowing. And that's what I do. I play around with the settings, I play around with the lighting and how the range and the intensity until I was happy with it. I also mess around with a few other settings in the post-process lighting, just to make sure that it looks different, a little bit better, and I think it looks a little better, especially for the claim and other things. But I do notice that the scene is still quite dark. I'll sort that out a little bit later. Now, a quick mention here, what I decided to do is try and have high definition render pipeline imported. While this is importing, I ended up removing it. I cut all of it out and remove it. I spent quite a few hours trying to fix a lot of issues. I found that high definition render pipeline has too many issues with it when you're trying to import it into a scene that already is quite complex. There are a lot of issues that aren't catalogued on forums and people don't talk about, things like immediate crashing and stuff. So after I eventually gave up on high definition render pipeline, I decided to sort out all the lights for the claim into the other tree claims, all the different game objects so that they're set up. And then I add in the smoke texture which I created, just a basic smoke texture for the mist, and then made sure it's transparent, and then add it onto the created material and then added it into the texture, into the particle for the mist, but it didn't really work out. Then I added the clay material to all the other different claims for the other scenes. Then what I did was I wanted an earth to be above or below the scene, so either through the water or in the sky with where the cube is and the light's going to it, to add a bit of atmosphere, like it's ciphering energy to the earth, to add a bit of lore. This is another thing that I ended up just scrapping because it just did not look good. It looked weird, and so I decided to get rid of that. The next thing I did was I wanted a variation of green in the trees and the plants because it was a bit too similar, and in the scene it just looks almost the same. So I made the leaves that were already dark even darker, and I made the leaves that were bright a little bit brighter, and then created my own personal materials for them because previously they were using the materials from Blender. So now we have our own proper material for it, and it looks a little bit. I play around with the smoothness and make it sure that it looks quite nice and a little bit better, which I think it does. I think it looks a little bit better than what we previously had. So next, what I do is quick test to see what it looks like. I think it looks good. I think it looks nice. And then what I do is I want to create a way of lighting up this scene a little bit more, especially underneath the platforms. So what I do is I create a new lighting source, which is a crystal. I use the rocks that we've already got, create a new game object, and then just change the texture of the rocks that we have. So create two different variations, and then make sure that there's a new material for these crystals. I want it to have emission again because I want it to do the same thing as the clay, but I want it to be slightly transparent, the material, and quite big. These will be underneath all different platforms. So what I actually just try out first is adding different textures on to see if it kind of adds to it, to add a little bit of detail, but in the end I eventually just remove it. That one's quite nice, but I still remove it, and then I make it a little bit transparent, change the colour around to see what I want. I eventually go with the light green, and then just try it out. So there we go, make it a bit transparent as if it is a crystal, and then I end up having what I want, and then decide to just go with it. Make sure that all the scale is correct, and then make it a prefab. Then I add in lighting, and this is just another point light that I make sure the range is quite high. There was a lot of playing around with this that I cut out. There was tons that I ended up changing with the crystal light settings because it just didn't seem right. Then I add them to the tree island initially, and then decide to just add them to the platform prefab at the bottom. Initially the light is in these, in the actual prefab of the crystals. I do eventually remove that and then put it into the prefab itself. There you just saw me trying to animate the crystals and make them flash the lights. I also make sure that I randomize the two different prefabs to have different speeds because I'm using different crystals within the platform. This gives it a bit of a randomness. Might change that in a script later on to have it even more random, but there we go. Got a little bit of randomness, a little bit of lighting changes, and after that I decide to randomize the rotation of the trees, because something I didn't do before release was change the look. All the trees and all the plants were all facing the same way. This is just because I ran out of time, but it looks really unnatural, especially when you're looking down from a higher perspective and you can see the map. So I rotate a lot of those trees around. Then what I do is I implement all of the directional lights changes, the clay material changes, and the point light changes, as well as the lighting settings for individual scenes into all the different scenes. That is basically as I went through to making all these changes to the original scene, which is 1A, I was writing them down as I went what I'd changed, and then so I could implement them to all the other scenes later. And that's exactly what I do here. And I think it looks quite nice. So here I am just changing all the lighting settings and making sure that everything is good. And this was one of the last things I actually did for all the changes. So next thing what I wanted to do was actually, I decided that the skylighting, the skybox was just too intense and too ridiculous. And so I didn't want to spend any time trying to make another skybox textures, so I just found some online. This one was from Bright Shining Star, which is free, and so I just thought I'd get those. They're not as intense and they kind of blend in with the scene a lot better, and so when I test it out here, it just looks much nicer than what I previously had. What I previously had was something that I created. It was a skybox I created, which I just thought it just doesn't really suit. Then make sure that the skybox is correct. I then apply a different skybox, which there was 3 different skybox textures that came with it, and I applied them to the different scenes. Next, what I did was I created my own texture, and I wanted to try and create a texture for the ground again. So I had a texture that I created. I created a normal map on this site, which is free. Then I created a displacement map, an ambient occlusion map, a specular map, and did all this for the ground. So I've already done this before, but I wanted to give it another try. Since I felt like it was worth it. I really felt like the ground needed a little bit more diversity in the look of it. So I created all these different maps, and this time I spent a long time playing around with the settings to make it blend better and really stand out. And you'll see in a moment that my work paid off much better than it did previously. I don't know if last time I created things like displacement and occlusion maps, specular maps, but this time I did. So I set up all the textures and all the material, and make sure that I customize it. Also, previously I had a specific color created for the texture. This time I made it black and white so that I could make the color anything. And here you go, I'm setting it all up. You should notice some immediate changes when I play. It looks a lot better, it stands out a little bit more, but I still don't think it's quite good. It still has that low polygon feel to it, which I like, but I make some more changes to it, and like I said, I spent a long time trying to get what I wanted, and I think it looks quite nice. I actually quite like it. It doesn't really stand out too much that it's a distraction, but it does blend, but it is enough, and you can see that the light also bounces off the edges, so when it comes to the claim, which makes it stand out even better and look quite nice. So moving on, I noticed an issue with the lighting on the crystals, that they were in the wrong place, so we're inside the crystals sometimes or inside the platform. So this is when I actually removed them from the prefab and put them in the island themselves into the platform, and so I could position the light below it. Then I started looking at reflections for the water. This time I wanted the water to have a proper reflection, and I didn't really like it that much. I think it didn't look great. I've played around with reflections before, but I never really liked them all that much. So what you do is you actually make the material of the water smoothness really high, and then you add a reflection probe, and change the settings accordingly to what you like. So I added the reflection. I didn't really like it that much, so I do eventually scrap that as well. In this video, you may have noticed I scrap a lot of things and show you a lot of things that I do. This actually happens pretty often. I usually cut it out of my videos, but this time I've decided to show it. I make some minor changes to the very last scene because I felt like it just didn't seem like you were isolated enough. And then I made a lot of the game objects were not sorted correctly, so I sort them out, and then I reorganize everything. I then animate. And then what I do is I also want to add an animation to the platform at the center. At this point I realized that I hadn't actually added the animations for the tree platforms though. So I make sure I go back in a minute and add all of the animations that I'd missed onto the previous scene's animations, which is what you can see. So that way it all moves, and I make sure that all of the islands are correct, and things that I've done previously. And once that was all done, I then go back to the very last scene and make the center island animated. I skip forward a little bit to when I'm smoothing out the animation and make sure that it looks good, and then I play it. It floats just as you'd expect. I change the speed of it. Again, might be controlled in the script, I don't know. And yeah, I think it looks good. I try it out. Things look nice, and I'm happy with that. Next, I move on to water. Again, I just didn't want to spend too much time on some of these things. I was running low on time, and water is something I can create anyway, but I just wanted to make something that was free. That was made by Lowly Poly, so thanks to him for giving some free water texture material, and so I applied that, changed the UV size around, and played with other settings to make sure it was happy, so making it smooth, reflective a little bit. I also added two water texture objects. This was so that I could have a variation of speed later on. So there you go, I've made the smoothness a bit too high there. and so I did a little bit playing around. Yeah, I have two different water so that they have two different speeds, and here we go, I'm creating a script so that the water can move. This is just a simple scrolling script. I've done this before in a previous video. It's very simple, and then add them to the game objects for the water, and then change the speeds around. Obviously a bit too high, that one, so I change the speed as I like, and then I make the second water a different speed. I also make the textures slightly transparent so that you can see both of them slightly, and this gives a variation as if the water has a little bit of a quicker current underneath. I think it looks quite nice, and I kind of like it. And then what I want to do is I also made sure that the border tag was on the water as well, so that when you fall into it you would respawn at the checkpoint, so everything worked. So yeah, a lot of playing around and a lot of fixing of different things. I think it looks quite nice, I think it works, and I like it. So what I also do is delete the reflective probe, because I just don't think it works. It's not necessary. It just did not work at all. And then I added all of the water that I've created, the new water from our other scene into the other scenes we've done. So from the last scene into the other, all the way through. And yeah, so this is what it looks like, normal speed. Is me just playing around, looking around on the very last scene. We've got the crystals at the bottom, the trees are moving obviously with the animation we did in the last video. Things look nicer, textures look better, it looks a bit brighter, the scene. I like it actually, it looks quite good, and I'm happy with it. So that's what we've done. It was a lot this episode that I've managed to put in. I went fast at certain points, hopefully you didn't get too lost. But yeah, there was a lot in this, and hopefully in the next video what we'll do is we'll be looking at enemies. We'll be creating some enemies in Blender. I'll specifically be focusing on Blender next episode, so it won't be in Unity, and I'll specifically be making models for different corrupted monsters we can fight and different enemies. Yeah, so hopefully you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.